What made a young person in the year 1250 pack their meager belongings and journey hundreds of miles across treacherous roads? Why would someone leave their home and family for years, all in the pursuit of scrolls and lectures? Number 1. Specialized knowledge centers. In the swirling currents of medieval Europe, where information traveled at the pace of a horse or a sailing ship, a remarkable truth became clear to anyone seeking higher learning. Not all universities were the same. A university was not just a collection of professors and students. Many developed distinct personalities, specializing in particular branches of knowledge like a master craftsman perfecting their trade. If a young mind hungered for a specific type of wisdom, they knew precisely where to direct their travels. This specialization was a powerful magnet, pulling ambitious students from across the entire continent. The city of Bologna, in northern Italy, for instance, stood as the undisputed capital for the study of law. It wasn't just a good law school, it was the law school. Long before printing presses made books widely available, the city held ancient copies of Roman civil law texts, particularly Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis, which had been largely lost to Western Europe for centuries. When a scholar named Irnerius began lecturing on these texts in the late 11th century, something extraordinary happened. Students flocked to him. They meticulously copied his glosses, his notes, and interpretations alongside the original Roman legal codes. This intense focus on Roman law, and later on canon law, which was the law of the Church, gave Bologna an unmatched reputation. Students arriving in Bologna often found themselves surrounded by serious-minded individuals, many of whom were older than typical undergraduates. Already having some practical experience and aiming for careers as judges, advocates, or administrators in burgeoning city-states or powerful church offices. Records from the era describe how students, rather than professors, actually formed a powerful corporation in Bologna, dictating terms to their teachers, setting lecture times, and even levying fines for poor performance. This unique student power solidified Bologna's identity as a place where practical, applicable legal knowledge was king. Across the Alps, in the vibrant city of Paris, a different intellectual energy pulsed through the crowded streets and quiet cloisters. Paris was the grand dame of arts and theology. Here, the focus was on dialectic, logic, philosophy, and the profound mysteries of Christian doctrine. If Bologna built legal frameworks, Paris built intellectual cathedrals. The University of Paris grew out of the Cathedral School of Notre Dame and quickly became the leading center for theological debate. Figures like Peter Abelard, with his sharp wit and willingness to challenge traditional interpretations, drew thousands of students, even if his methods sometimes landed him in trouble with ecclesiastical authorities. Later, the great minds of Thomas Aquinas and Duns Scotus would grace its halls, shaping Christian thought for centuries through their rigorous syntheses of Aristotelian philosophy and Christian theology. The intellectual atmosphere in Paris was one of intense disputation, public debates where scholars would argue complex points, sharpening their minds and advancing knowledge through logical reasoning. Students here were often seeking a deeper understanding of the world, preparing for careers in the church as bishops, abbots, or papal advisors, or simply driven by a profound intellectual curiosity that found its truest expression in the philosophical and theological arguments. Further south, nestled on the Italian coast, lay Salerno, a city whose name became synonymous with the healing arts. The Scuola Medica Salernitana, or Salerno Medical School, is often cited as the oldest medical school in Europe, preceding the formal university structures that emerged elsewhere. Its approach was remarkably practical and empirical, drawing on a rich tapestry of knowledge from Greek, Roman, and particularly Arab medical traditions. While other places might dabble in medicine, Salerno was wholly dedicated to it. Physicians from Salerno were renowned throughout Europe, and students traveled great distances to learn directly from masters who combined theoretical knowledge with hands-on observation. The arrival of figures like Constantinus Africanus in the 11th century, who translated numerous Arab medical texts into Latin, greatly enriched Salerno's curriculum, making it an unparalleled repository of medical wisdom. The school even admitted women as students and teachers, a rarity for the time. Students here were not just reading ancient texts. They were studying anatomy, pharmacology, and clinical practice, preparing to heal the sick and serve in noble courts or burgeoning towns. Other cities also carved out their own niches. Montpellier in southern France developed into another significant center for medicine, often considered Salerno's spiritual successor in the West. Orleans in France became a respected center for Roman law, drawing students who sought an alternative to Bologna. Even the emerging universities of Oxford and Cambridge in England, while initially strong in arts and theology, began to develop their own distinct academic traditions, often influenced by Paris, but with a unique English flavor. The rise of these specialized knowledge centers was not a random occurrence. It often grew organically from existing monastic or cathedral schools that happened to have a particularly strong master or an exceptional collection of texts in a specific field. Sometimes it was a deliberate effort by a ruler or a powerful church figure who wished to establish a renowned center of learning in their domain. For students, this specialization meant that their journey was not just about getting an education, but about getting the best education in their chosen field. If a young man from England or Germany desired to become a great canon lawyer, he knew he had to journey to Bologna, regardless of the distance or the danger. If a scholar from Spain sought to unravel the deepest theological questions, Paris beckoned. The presence of specialized texts was a huge draw. Before printing presses, books were laboriously copied by hand, making them incredibly valuable and rare. A university town that specialized in, say, medicine, would have an unparalleled collection of medical treatises in its libraries, making it a treasure trove for students. Similarly, the presence of practitioners in a field meant that students could see their studies applied in the real world. Law students in Bologna might observe court proceedings, while medical students in Salerno could witness dissections or participate in patient care. This practical dimension added another layer of allure to these specialized institutions. The reputation of these centers grew through word of mouth and the success of their graduates. A degree from Bologna in law or from Paris in theology carried immense weight across Europe. It was a mark of quality signaling to potential employers or patrons that the graduate had received the highest possible training in their field. This international brand of learning made the arduous journey worthwhile. Students knew that an education from one of these renowned centers would open doors and opportunities that might otherwise remain closed. The entire academic environment in these places revolved around their specialty, creating an immersive learning experience where every discussion, every lecture, every public debate contributed to a deep understanding of their chosen subject. This deep dive into a specific field, guided by the greatest minds and surrounded by the most relevant texts, was a compelling reason for students to travel far and wide, making these specialized knowledge centers true magnets for ambitious and intellectually hungry individuals. Number 2. Reputation of renowned masters. What possesses a person to leave behind everything familiar and embark on a perilous journey spanning hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles across rough terrain, through forests where bandits lurked, and over mountains that tested the very spirit? In medieval Europe, a significant part of the answer often lay not just in the reputation of a university itself, but in the towering presence of a single, brilliant individual. Imagine the drawing power of a modern-day scientific genius or a celebrated artist, but amplified 1,000 times in an age before mass media. Students were not just seeking a degree. They were undertaking a pilgrimage to sit at the feet of an intellectual titan. The medieval concept of a master was profoundly personal and influential. These were not just professors, They were intellectual celebrities, rock stars of their age, whose ideas sparked passionate debates and whose lectures drew crowds like magnets. News of a particularly problematic or controversial teacher traveled across Europe by word of mouth, carried by merchants, pilgrims, and returning scholars. If a master had a groundbreaking interpretation of Aristotle, a fresh approach to a legal problem, or a daring new theological synthesis, students would hear about it and actively seek them out. Their intellectual prowess and personal charisma could literally define an entire academic generation. Consider Peter Abelard, a figure whose name still echoes through history. In the early 12th century, his lectures in Paris became legendary. He was renowned for his sharp logic, his captivating speaking style, and his willingness to tackle complex theological and philosophical questions head-on, often in ways that challenged established norms. His method of reasoning, which involved juxtaposing contradictory statements from ancient authorities to prompt critical analysis, captured the imaginations of thousands. Students from all corners of Europe, including England, Germany, and Italy, flocked to Paris solely to hear Abelard speak. They camped in tents, rented cramped rooms, or found lodgings in the homes of sympathetic townspeople, all just to be in his presence. The sheer volume of students he attracted was a testament to his magnetic personality and intellectual firepower. Records from the period speak of his ability to hold an audience spellbound, prompting fervent discussions long after his lectures ended. Even when he faced controversy and condemnation from church authorities for some of his theological views, his loyal student following remained steadfast, illustrating the deep personal connection they felt to their master. Another intellectual giant who drew students from far and wide was Thomas Aquinas, a Dominican friar who taught primarily in Paris during the 13th century. Unlike Abelard's more rebellious spirit, Aquinas was known for his monumental work in synthesizing Aristotelian philosophy with Christian theology. His rigorous, systematic approach, culminating in his unfinished masterpiece, the Summa Theologica, provided a comprehensive framework for understanding faith and reason. Students traveled to Paris specifically to study under him, attracted by his profound intellect, his clarity of thought, and his ability to reconcile seemingly disparate intellectual traditions. Aquinas' lectures were not just lessons. They were master classes in logical construction and theological insight. His influence was so vast that his ideas became the standard for Catholic theology for centuries. To be a student of Aquinas was to be at the very cutting edge of medieval intellectual thought. Albertus Magnus, another Dominican and the teacher of Thomas Aquinas, was himself a polymath of incredible breadth, known for his encyclopedic knowledge of natural philosophy, alchemy, astronomy, and even zoology, alongside theology. He was one of the first Western scholars to truly engage with the full scope of Aristotle's rediscovered works on natural sciences. Students who were curious about the natural world or who sought to understand the mechanics of the cosmos through a blend of observation and philosophical reasoning would travel to study under him in Cologne or Paris. His reputation as a scholar who dared to explore new intellectual territories made him a compelling figure for many aspiring thinkers. In the realm of law, Irnerius at Bologna held a similar revered status. His revival and systematic teaching of Roman law not only made Bologna the leading legal university, but also attracted students who understood that learning from the master himself was the surest path to becoming a skilled jurist. His interpretations or glosses on the ancient Roman legal texts were copied and disseminated, becoming essential tools for generations of lawyers. To study with Irnerius was to learn from the source, to inherit a direct intellectual lineage from the man who resurrected Roman legal thought for medieval Europe. These masters were not just distant figures. They often engaged directly with their students. Public disputations, a central part of medieval university life, were often led by masters and served as intellectual performances where they showcased their formidable skills in argumentation and knowledge. Students would attend these debates not only to learn the content, but also to observe the master's technique, hoping to emulate their intellectual dexterity. This direct student-teacher relationship, built on intellectual admiration and personal guidance, was a powerful draw. Students were not merely enrolled in an institution. They were often members of a master's school, subscribing to their methods and philosophical outlook. The writings produced by these masters, even though copied by hand, slowly circulated across Europe, further cementing their reputation and attracting future generations of students. A master's ideas could literally reshape an entire field of study. Rulers, popes, and powerful noble families also understood the prestige associated with hosting such intellectual giants. They would actively seek to attract great scholars to their universities, offering patronage and favorable conditions, knowing that a renowned master would in turn attract thousands of students and elevate the standing of their institution. For many students, traveling to hear a specific master was akin to a spiritual or intellectual pilgrimage. It was a deep personal commitment, a journey to absorb wisdom directly from a fount of knowledge. They knew that such an opportunity might be fleeting, and that the insights gained from a truly great teacher could shape their entire lives and careers. This pursuit of direct knowledge from the most brilliant minds of the age was a compelling reason for individuals to undertake incredible journeys across medieval Europe, seeking not just a qualification, but an encounter with intellectual greatness. Number 3. Path to social mobility and career opportunities. In the rigid social hierarchy of medieval Europe, where birth often determined destiny, education offered one of the few viable pathways for individuals to ascend beyond their station. For many, traveling across the continent to attend a university was not just about intellectual curiosity. It was a pragmatic, strategic investment in their future, a chance to forge a new path for themselves and their families. A university degree, though not a modern-day certification, was a powerful tool that could unlock doors to prestige, power, and wealth previously unimaginable for those not born into the aristocracy or the wealthiest merchant families. The church was by far the most common and powerful career avenue for educated individuals. For a bright young man from a humble background, perhaps the son of a peasant or a craftsman, gaining an education, usually sponsored by a local parish priest or a monastic order, was his only hope of escaping a life of manual labor. Once educated, he could enter the lower ranks of the clergy and, with continued study and talent, rise through the ecclesiastical hierarchy. Bishops, abbots of wealthy monasteries, and even high-ranking papal advisors often started their careers as university-educated clerics. Church offered not only spiritual fulfillment, but also significant temporal power, vast wealth, and widespread influence throughout Christendom. Thomas Becket, for example, famously rose from relatively modest origins to become Archbishop of Canterbury, a journey propelled by his education and administrative skills. An educated cleric was indispensable to the running of the vast and complex medieval church, from managing large dioceses to advising the Pope himself. Beyond the church, royal and princely courts across Europe were increasingly demanding educated individuals to serve as administrators, diplomats, secretaries, and lawyers. The burgeoning states of the medieval period required sophisticated governance, and crude military might was no longer enough. Rulers needed skilled men who could draft treaties, manage royal finances, interpret complex laws, and represent their interests abroad. A university education, particularly in law or the liberal arts, was the ideal preparation for such roles. A scholar from Bologna, versed in Roman and canon law, was highly sought after by kings who wanted to centralize their power and create more uniform legal systems within their realms. These positions not only offered significant influence, but also often came with generous stipends, land grants, and the prestige of serving at the heart of political power. The rise of secular law also created entirely new professional opportunities. As towns grew and commerce expanded, the need for trained jurists to handle disputes, draw up contracts, and advise local governments became critical. Universities like Bologna, with their emphasis on Roman law, were churning out graduates perfectly suited for these roles. A master of laws could become a highly respected and well-paid advocate, a town clerk, or a judge commanding authority and earning substantial fees. This was a path that did not necessarily require ordination, opening up opportunities for individuals who sought a secular career rooted in intellectual pursuits. Medicine, though a smaller field, also offered a path to a respected and potentially lucrative profession. As urban populations grew, so did the demand for skilled physicians. Graduates from schools like Salerno or Montpellier were esteemed figures, often serving noble families or wealthy merchants, offering remedies and advice in an age where sickness was ever present. Their knowledge, derived from ancient texts and practical observation, set them apart from local folk healers, giving them authority and status. It wasn't just about reaching the very top. Even a well-educated parish priest in a rural village or a town clerk in a modest city held a position of significant status and influence within their local community. They were often the most literate individuals relied upon for counsel, record-keeping, and communication with the wider world. For many, escaping the cycle of poverty and establishing a stable, respected, and relatively comfortable life was the ultimate goal, and education was the key. The economic incentive was clear. Compared to the uncertainty and hardship of manual labor, farming, or soldiering, a career enabled by a university education offered relative stability, security, and often significant wealth. Cleric status, which extended to many university students whether fully ordained or not, often granted them special legal protections, subjecting them to more lenient ecclesiastical courts rather than harsh secular justice, which was another subtle benefit. Beyond the formal curriculum, students gained invaluable practical skills: rhetoric, the art of persuasive speech and writing; argumentation, the ability to construct and defend a logical position; and organization, the capacity to manage complex information. These skills were highly transferable and useful in any professional setting, from a bishop's chancery to a king's court. In a largely illiterate society, those who could read, write, and manipulate complex ideas held immense power and influence. Universities were in essence the birthplace of many modern professions, laying the groundwork for the structured, specialized careers that would become increasingly important in the centuries to come. Of course, the journey was long, and the competition for prime positions was fierce. A university education was a significant investment, often taking many years to complete, and there was no guaranteed outcome. Families might pool their meager resources or seek out generous patrons to fund a promising son's studies, seeing it as a long-term strategic investment for the entire family's betterment. The allure of a life beyond the inherited station, the promise of influence, wealth, and respect, was a powerful motivator, driving students from across Europe to undertake the arduous journey in pursuit of social mobility and unparalleled career opportunities. Number 4. Intellectual curiosity and pursuit of truth. Beyond the pragmatic goals of social mobility or professional advancement, a profound human drive fueled the arduous journeys of many medieval students, a pure, unadulterated intellectual curiosity, and a relentless pursuit of truth. For many, attending a university was less about getting a job and more about embarking on a profound quest for understanding, to unravel the mysteries of God, the universe, and humanity's place within it. The 12th and 13th centuries witnessed an intellectual explosion in Europe, largely ignited by the rediscovery of ancient Greek texts, particularly the complete works of Aristotle. For centuries, only a small fraction of Aristotle's writings had been known in the West. But through Arabic translations and commentaries filtering into Europe, via centers like Toledo in Spain and Palermo in Sicily, a vast new world of knowledge opened up. Aristotle, with his systematic logic, his empirical observations of the natural world, and his profound philosophical inquiries presented a powerful challenge and a rich resource for medieval thinkers. This influx of new material created an intellectual ferment, a palpable excitement in the air that drew bright minds towards the new centers of learning. The intellectual method that emerged to grapple with these new texts was scholasticism. This was not a philosophy itself, but a rigorous method of inquiry focused on reconciling faith and reason and bringing logical order to theological and philosophical questions. It emphasized meticulous reading of authoritative texts, the use of dialectic, logical argumentation, and systematic debate. The central activity of a university student was not just passive listening but active engagement in disputations. These public debates, often held in large halls and sometimes attracting townspeople, were the intellectual gladiatorial contests of the age. Students were trained to present arguments, anticipate counter-arguments, and defend their positions with logical precision. This process was thrilling for those with a keen mind, a direct engagement with the most challenging questions of existence. Peter Abelard, with his famous work Sic et Non, Yes and No, perfectly embodied this spirit of intellectual inquiry. He presented contradictory statements from respected authorities on various theological and philosophical topics, challenging his students not to simply accept dogma, but to critically analyze, reconcile, or choose between opposing views. This method was radical for its time, encouraging independent thought and sparking a deep desire to understand the underlying truth behind seemingly conflicting ideas. It was a call to intellectual adventure. The intellectual landscape was also enriched by significant contributions from Arab scholars. Figures like Avicenna and Averroes had preserved, translated, and commented on classical Greek texts, but they had also made their own profound advancements in medicine, mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. The transmission of this knowledge to Europe opened up new avenues of scientific and philosophical thought, pushing the boundaries of what was known and understood. Students felt a palpable excitement as they encountered ideas that had been dormant in the West for centuries, or entirely new insights from a different civilization. For many, the pursuit of knowledge was a spiritual journey, a path to understanding God's creation. The belief that reason and faith could be reconciled, that logic could illuminate divine truths, was a powerful motivator. Theology was considered the queen of sciences not because it was exclusive, but because it sought to integrate all other forms of knowledge into a coherent understanding of the divine order. Students delved into complex questions about the nature of good and evil, free will, the existence of God, and the structure of the cosmos, all guided by the tools of logic and philosophy. The intellectual freedom, though relative and often constrained by theological boundaries, was surprising. Within the established methods of scholastic inquiry, there was considerable room for rigorous debate and exploration of different interpretations. Universities fostered an environment where challenging questions were not only permitted, but actively encouraged, as long as they adhered to the rules of logic and respectful discourse. This open intellectual atmosphere, where new ideas were constantly being explored and refined, was a powerful draw for those with a truly inquisitive mind. The public nature of learning was also captivating. Lectures were open, disputations were public events, and the intellectual buzz extended beyond the lecture halls into taverns and dormitories where students continued their debates late into the night. It fostered a vibrant intellectual community where ideas flowed freely, where one could constantly learn from peers and masters alike. This shared intellectual culture, rooted in common texts and methods, created a bond among scholars across Europe, transcending linguistic and political boundaries. The university was a place where students could systematically pursue scientific knowledge based on reasoned principles, moving beyond mere opinion or tradition. For many, it was the only place where they could truly engage with the most complex and profound questions of their age, guided by the greatest minds. This deep-seated desire to understand, to debate, and to ultimately grasp the truth was a fundamental and compelling reason for thousands of students to undertake the challenging journey to medieval universities. Number 5. Escape from local canes and lack of opportunity. For many young individuals in medieval Europe, the decision to travel far from home for an education was not simply an intellectual calling or a pragmatic career choice. It was often a desperate escape from the suffocating limitations of their local environment. In an age before widespread schooling, the vast majority of people lived and died within a few miles of their birthplace, their lives largely predetermined by their social status and geographical location. For those with ambition, or simply a spark of unusual intelligence, a university offered a potential lifeline, a means to break free from the constraints of feudal society or the stagnant routines of provincial life. In most rural areas, formal educational opportunities were almost non-existent. A local village might have a parish priest who could teach basic literacy and religious instruction, but anything beyond that was rare. Books were scarce, and learned teachers even more so. For a bright peasant's son, for instance, the path forward was almost always to follow in his father's footsteps, tilling the land bound by feudal obligations. If, by some extraordinary stroke of luck, his intelligence was recognized, perhaps by an enlightened local lord or a sympathetic priest, he might be sponsored to attend a university. This was an incredibly rare occurrence, but the very possibility, however slim, offered a glimmer of hope for an otherwise predetermined future. The journey itself symbolized a break from the confines of his birth, a step into a world of possibility. Even for sons of lesser nobility or gentry who might have access to some basic tutors, a university education offered a vital alternative. The system of primogeniture, where the eldest son inherited the family lands and titles, left younger sons often without a clear path forward. Without land, their options were limited. They could become soldiers, enter a monastery, or seek a career in the church or royal administration. The last two options were precisely what a university education could provide. It was a way to gain influence and purpose without inheriting a physical domain, offering a life of respect and security that might otherwise be denied. Beyond economic and social limitations, there was also the intellectual desert effect. For someone with a genuine thirst for knowledge, life in a smaller town or rural setting could feel intellectually stifling. There were few books, no public debates, and limited opportunities for engaging with complex ideas. University towns, by contrast, were vibrant hubs of intellectual activity, buzzing with diverse discussions and new ideas. The opportunity to finally engage with challenging concepts, to debate with peers, and to learn from renowned scholars was a powerful draw for those who felt constrained by their local intellectual environment. The special legal privileges granted to university students and masters also offered a form of freedom from local authority. In a feudal system, individuals were often subject to the arbitrary will of their local lord, or the sometimes harsh justice of town courts. University charters, often granted by the Pope or the Emperor, placed students under the jurisdiction of more lenient ecclesiastical courts, or granted them exemptions from certain taxes or military service. This meant a degree of legal protection and autonomy that was largely unheard of for ordinary citizens. For some, this freedom from local obligations and oversight was a silent but significant draw, a chance to live a life with fewer burdens and more personal liberties. There was also a subtle, perhaps even unspoken desire for anonymity. In a small village or town, everyone knew everyone else's business. A student in a large university city like Paris or Bologna could experience a degree of personal freedom and anonymity that was impossible back home. This allowed them to pursue unconventional ideas, associate with different types of people, and generally live a life with less scrutiny from family or local gossips. This sense of liberation, however temporary, was undoubtedly appealing to many young minds. The journey itself, fraught with dangers from highway robbers, disease, and unpredictable weather, underscored the intensity of this motivation. The cost and peril involved in traveling such distances highlight just how strong the desire to escape local limitations truly was. It was not a decision taken lightly. Finally, the cosmopolitan nature of university towns was a stark contrast to isolated provincial life. Students from all corners of Europe converged in these centers, bringing with them different languages, customs, and perspectives. This exposure to a wider world beyond the confines of their familiar village or town was an education in itself. It broadened their horizons, provided new ways of seeing the world, and prepared them for lives that would extend far beyond their humble origins. The pull of this dynamic, intellectually rich, and liberating environment was a compelling reason for individuals to leave behind the familiar and venture into the unknown, seeking opportunity and freedom that simply did not exist in their local communities. Number 6. Ecclesiastical endorsement and support. The medieval university, as we understand it today, cannot be separated from the immense influence and active endorsement of the Church. For many students, traveling to a university was not just a personal choice. It was a path strongly encouraged, supported, and often directly facilitated by the most powerful institution in medieval Europe. The Church saw the cultivation of educated minds as essential to its mission, its administration, and its very intellectual authority, creating a robust framework that encouraged scholars to travel and study. Universities largely evolved from earlier cathedral schools, which were established by bishops in major cities to train clergy. As these schools grew in size and complexity, and as more diverse subjects began to be taught, they gradually transformed into the autonomous corporations known as universities. Pope, as the spiritual and often temporal head of Western Christendom, quickly recognized the strategic importance of these burgeoning centers of learning. Papal bulls, official decrees from the Pope, became instrumental in granting universities their privileges, protecting their students and masters, and establishing their legitimacy. The University of Paris, for example, was often referred to as the eldest daughter of the Church due to its intimate ties with the papacy. Famous papal bull Parens Scientiarum, Mother of Sciences, issued by Pope Gregory IX in 1231, was a landmark document for Paris, granting the university significant autonomy from local secular authorities and laying down crucial regulations. Such papal endorsement elevated the status of these institutions, and by extension, the value of an education obtained within them. Theology, the study of divine things, was universally considered the queen of sciences in medieval universities. This was not merely a title. It reflected the deep integration of faith and reason within the academic framework. While other subjects, like law, medicine, and arts, were vital, they were often seen as serving or contributing to the ultimate understanding of God and His creation. This focus meant that theological chairs and faculties received immense patronage and scholarly attention. For any young man aspiring to a significant career within the Church, to become a bishop, a cardinal, an abbot, or a papal advisor, a university education, particularly in theology or canon law, was almost a prerequisite. It was the primary route to high office, and the Church actively sought out and cultivated promising scholars to fill its ranks. Ecclesiastical patronage was widespread. Bishops, wealthy abbots, and even the Pope himself would fund students, especially those from poorer backgrounds who showed intellectual promise. This ensured a steady supply of well-educated clergy and administrators for the Church's vast and complex operations. Many students traveled with the explicit backing of a church dignitary who would provide financial support, letters of introduction, and the promise of a benefice, a church office with an income, upon graduation. This sponsorship made the daunting prospect of long-distance travel and years of study financially feasible for many who would otherwise have been unable to afford it. The mendicant orders, particularly the Dominicans and Franciscans, played a pivotal role in strengthening the ties between the Church and universities. These orders established their own houses of study within university towns and sent their brightest members to study and teach at the universities. Figures like Thomas Aquinas and Albertus Magnus were prominent members of the Dominican order, and their presence at the University of Paris not only elevated its theological reputation but also illustrated the Church's deep commitment to intellectual inquiry. These orders saw universities as vital training grounds for their preachers, theologians, and missionaries, who needed to be equipped with rigorous logical and theological tools to defend the faith and engage with the intellectual challenges of the age. Church's need for educated administrators extended beyond just priests and theologians. It required skilled canon lawyers to manage its extensive legal system, secretaries to handle its voluminous correspondence, and diplomats to represent its interests in courts across Europe. Universities provided precisely this kind of training. Furthermore, universities served as critical centers for defining and defending church doctrine, combating heresy, and providing intellectual justifications for papal authority. The academic debates and scholarly works produced within university walls were crucial to maintaining the Church's intellectual authority in a rapidly changing world. The international character of the Church also meant that a scholar trained in one major university, say Paris or Bologna, could serve anywhere in Christendom. This portability of their education facilitated international travel for study, as students knew their skills would be recognized and valued across different kingdoms and regions. The universal language of Latin used throughout the Church and academia further cemented this pan-European intellectual community, allowing scholars from diverse linguistic backgrounds to communicate and share knowledge packing. From the preservation of knowledge in monastic libraries in earlier centuries to the active foundation and support of universities in the High Middle Ages, the Church acted as a unifying force, creating a common intellectual framework across a politically fragmented Europe. Its explicit endorsement and unwavering support were fundamental reasons why so many students embarked on long and challenging journeys to these centers of learning. They were not just pursuing personal advancement, they were participating in an institution deeply intertwined with the spiritual and intellectual heart of their world. Number 7. Economic benefits of university towns. Life in a medieval university town was not just about dusty scrolls and solemn lectures. These centers of learning were dynamic, bustling urban environments, brimming with economic activity driven almost entirely by the presence of thousands of students and masters. For many, the prospect of living in such a vibrant, specialized economy, with its unique services and opportunities, was a compelling reason to undertake the arduous journey. It offered a kind of economic ecosystem distinct from the agricultural life most people knew. Imagine arriving in a city like Paris or Bologna. You'd immediately notice the specialized trades catering specifically to the academic population. Scribes were constantly busy copying texts by hand, as printing presses were still centuries away. Parchment makers worked tirelessly to supply the raw material for books, often located near the university districts. Booksellers, though more like organized copy shops, offered texts for sale or rent. Stationers provided pens, ink, and other writing implements. Money changers were crucial, as students arrived with currency from various regions needing to convert it to local coin. Taverns and inns, while often associated with less academic pursuits, were vital for lodging, food, and social gathering. Laundresses, tailors, barbers, and even purveyors of specialized foods created a microeconomy designed around student needs. University authorities, or local town councils, often tried to regulate prices for essential services, like lodging, wine, and books, to prevent gouging. These efforts, though not always successful, demonstrate the economic impact of the student population and the efforts to create a stable living environment. Students, especially those from the nation's organized groups of students from the same geographic region, often had access to internal welfare systems, loans, and support for those in need, further solidifying the economic safety net within the university community. University was, in effect, a massive economic engine for the towns in which they were situated. The sheer number of students and masters meant a constant influx of money, stimulating local commerce and creating numerous jobs for townspeople. While the privileges granted to students and masters often caused friction with the local population, the economic benefits were undeniable. Shopkeepers, landlords, and service providers all relied heavily on the student clientele. Presence of a university guaranteed a steady flow of income and consumer demand, transforming the town into a thriving commercial hub. Student expenses, even with some regulations, could be substantial. Tuition fees, though not always formal in the modern sense, students often paid masters directly for lectures, along with the cost of lodging, food, books, and living expenses, required significant financial backing. This meant that families often had to finance their children's education, or students had to secure patronage from a wealthy individual, a monastic order, or the church. For those who arrived with limited funds, opportunities for loans, sometimes from official university chests or from informal networks, existed. Pawnbrokers were also a common sight in university towns, providing quick cash for students in a pinch. University towns were often situated near existing trading hubs, or grew into them, making access to supplies easier. The entire urban fabric adapted to the presence of the university. The demand for specific goods, like high-quality parchment, specialized inks, or even particular types of food for foreign students, created a unique market. The intellectual economy itself was a burgeoning industry, with the copying and sale of textbooks, the demand for lectures, and the growing professional class of scholars creating a new kind of wealth. Tension between town and gown was frequently economic in nature. Townspeople often resented the legal privileges of students, who were exempt from certain taxes or tried in different courts. Yet, they simultaneously relied on the students for their livelihoods. This dynamic created a push-pull relationship where economic necessity often outweighed local grievances. Beyond purely academic, university towns offered a chance to experience a larger, more dynamic world than most rural villages. They were cosmopolitan centers, attracting people from diverse backgrounds, offering a broader range of social interactions, recreational activities, and perhaps even opportunities for informal work. Students could find part-time employment as scribes, tutors, or assistants to masters, supplementing their income. The vibrant urban atmosphere, coupled with the specialized economic infrastructure, made these towns incredibly attractive for aspiring scholars. It was not just about the classroom. It was about immersing oneself in an environment where the pursuit of knowledge was the driving force of the entire local economy, providing a stable, if often lively, existence for those who chose to reside there. Number 8. Development of university charters and legal privileges. Life in medieval Europe was often uncertain, governed by local customs, the arbitrary will of a lord, or the sometimes brutal justice of town magistrates. For a student traveling across dangerous roads to an unfamiliar city, the prospect of being vulnerable to these local powers was daunting. However, a significant development in the medieval period provided a powerful incentive for students to travel for education. The granting of specific charters and legal privileges by powerful authorities like emperors, kings, and popes. These documents created a unique legal bubble around universities, protecting students and masters and making academic life far more appealing and secure. One of the earliest and most influential of these protections was Emperor Frederick I Barbarossa's Authentica Habita, issued around 1155 or 1158. This imperial decree specifically protected traveling students, declaring them to be under the emperor's special care. It granted them safe passage, exempted them from certain tolls, and crucially, stipulated that if a student was accused of a crime, they should be tried by their own masters or by the local bishop's court, rather than by the locanary concept. It meant that students, who were often young, foreign, and potentially rowdy, were not subject to the often harsh and unfair justice of a local mayor or judge who might be biased against them in disputes with townspeople. Instead, they would be judged by their intellectual peers or sympathetic ecclesiastical authorities who understood their unique situation. This privilege of being tried by ecclesiastical courts rather than secular ones became a cornerstone of university autonomy, particularly in places like Paris. Papal bull Parens Scientiarum, issued by Pope Gregory IX for the University of Paris in 1231, solidified this and other protections. It granted the university significant freedom from the Bishop of Paris, allowing it to regulate its own affairs, set its own curricula, and enforce its own discipline. This papal intervention was crucial in establishing the university as a distinct legal entity, independent of the usual civic and ecclesiastical structures. Royal charters also played a vital role. Kings, recognizing the value of educated administrators and the prestige a university brought to their realm, granted their own sets of privileges. These often included exemptions from military service, from certain taxes, and from various forms of communal labor. Students and masters were often given the right to carry arms for their own defense, a practical necessity on dangerous roads, and a clear distinction from ordinary citizens. Power to set fair prices for lodging and books, often negotiated directly by the university with local landlords and booksellers, protected students from exploitation. The system in Bologna, where students formed powerful corporations, known as nations based on their geographic origin, demonstrated the power of these privileges. Students in Bologna effectively hired their professors, controlled lecture schedules, and even fined masters for poor attendance or dull lectures. This was an astonishing level of student power, reflecting the strength of their organized corporate body and their legal protections. If their privileges were violated, students and masters had a powerful weapon: the cessatio, or strike. They would simply stop lecturing or attending classes, or even migrate en masse to another city if their demands were not met. The famous dispersion of Oxford scholars to Cambridge in the early 13th century, following disputes with the townspeople, is a prime example of this. Such mass movements would cripple the local economy and reputation, forcing authorities to concede. This ability to strike or migrate showed that their privileges were not just theoretical. They had real-world teeth. Constant friction between town and gown was a feature of medieval university life, but the charters generally sided with gown. This protection from arbitrary arrest or unjust treatment by townspeople was a major selling point. Students, many of whom were young and far from home, felt a sense of security knowing they belonged to a special protected class, often under the direct patronage of the Pope or Emperor. Church had a deep interest in protecting these intellectual centers because they produced the educated clergy, canon lawyers, and administrators essential for its vast operations. Similarly, emperors and kings saw universities as vital for training the skilled personnel needed to run their increasingly complex states and legal systems. These powerful endorsements elevated the status of students from mere transient foreigners to a privileged corporate body with distinct rights. In practical terms, these legal protections meant less fear of arbitrary imprisonment, less risk of being unjustly accused, and a greater sense of security while pursuing their studies. For students making the long and perilous journey, these charters offered a sense of belonging to a pan-European intellectual community that transcended local laws and offered a haven of learning protected by the highest authorities in Christendom. The development of these charters and legal privileges laid the foundational groundwork for the concept of academic independence and the unique structures of universities that we recognize today, making them uniquely attractive destinations for learning. Number 9. Network building and future connections. Stepping into a medieval university was not just about gaining knowledge from old books and learned masters. It was about entering a vibrant international community that would profoundly shape a student's future. For many young scholars, the opportunity to build a vast network of connections, both intellectual and social, was a powerful, often unspoken reason to travel across Europe. These bonds, forged in lecture halls, taverns, and lodging houses, often became lifelong assets, opening doors to careers, patronage, and influence that would have been impossible to achieve otherwise. Imagine a young scholar, perhaps from a remote region of Germany, arriving in Paris. He might initially feel lost in the bustling, multilingual city. However, he would soon find his way to his nation, a student organization based on geographic origin. Universities like Paris and Bologna were divided into several nations. For example, the French, Norman, Picard, and English nations in Paris, or the various Italian and transmontane, beyond the mountains nations in Bologna. These were far more than just social clubs. They were powerful corporate bodies that provided mutual support, regulated student life, and even served as legal entities, representing their members' interests against the university or the town. Here, a student from Saxony could meet someone from Aragon. A Burgundian could share lodging with an Irishman, all united by their shared pursuit of knowledge in a foreign land. Within these nations and through common classes, students formed deep friendships. They would discuss ideas late into the night, share notes, help each other through difficult texts, and collectively navigate the challenges of student life. These intense, shared experiences created bonds that often lasted a lifetime. Philosophy class might bring together a future bishop, a royal advisor, and a celebrated legal scholar, each contributing to and benefiting from the other's perspectives. The diverse backgrounds of students meant an exchange of cultural ideas, news from distant lands, and different perspectives on faith and politics. Students inadvertently became carriers of information and innovation, spreading new ideas as they moved between regions. The impact of these connections played out significantly in later life. A former classmate who rose to a position of power within the church might recommend a peer for a desirable benefice or administrative role. A royal advisor, remembering the intellectual rigor of a former fellow student, might seek them out for a crucial legal or diplomatic assignment. Merchants, who often sent their sons to universities to learn law or administration, could leverage these academic ties to facilitate trade routes or secure favorable commercial agreements. The medieval world relied heavily on personal connections and patronage, and the university was a prime breeding ground for such relationships. The ius ubique docendi, the right to teach everywhere granted to masters by papal or imperial decrees, meant that a master who earned their degree at a prestigious university could, theoretically, teach at any other university in Christendom. This privilege not only highlighted the universal nature of medieval education, but also meant that a master's network could literally span the entire continent as they moved between institutions or maintained correspondence. Beyond the formal lectures and debates, the informal intellectual sparring in taverns, dormitories, and common rooms was crucial for network building. These settings fostered robust intellectual communities, where students and masters continued their discussions, refined their arguments, and cemented their relationships. Students from various disciplines might interact, cross-pollinating ideas and broadening each other's horizons beyond their specialized fields. The role of patronage was central to career advancement, and universities were fertile ground for finding patrons. Wealthy bishops, powerful abbots, or influential noble families often funded promising students. These patrons would often maintain contact with their protégés during their studies and, upon graduation, guiding them into suitable careers within the church royal courts or wealthy households. A well-connected student could leverage their university network to secure such patronage, leading to a stable and prestigious future. The growth of literacy among this educated class facilitated continued communication after graduation. Letters and correspondence flowed between former students and masters, creating a pan-European intellectual community. Scholars would share their ongoing research, seek advice, and exchange news, further solidifying the bonds forged during their university years. This constant intellectual exchange fostered a sense of shared purpose and collective identity among the educated elite of Europe. In essence, the medieval university was a microcosm of the wider society, a melting pot where individuals from different social classes, nationalities, and backgrounds converged. The interactions within this diverse environment prepared students for the complex, interconnected world they would navigate in their professional lives. The networks built during their student years were invaluable assets, providing access to opportunities, support, and influence that were simply unavailable to those who remained within their local confines. For many, the journey to a medieval university was not just about acquiring knowledge, but about joining a powerful, lifelong network that would define their future success and reach.